So they're going to.
After you parked your car and came to the auditorium. We had a little conflicting information as to where to park, so I'm sorry if you parked over there and had to walk over there. If we do this again at Sturt High School, obviously we'll park at the Y and come in that way. So thank you so much for being here. Again, my name is Robin Hage, and I'm the coordinator of these local history lecture series. We are streaming it live right now at this time, and you are in for a very special treat tonight. We have Ted Long with us and Matthew McNulty, and they are going to present their project called Remarkable in the 419. It's an interactive website. I highly encourage you to check it out after this evening's presentation. We do have another lecture that's coming up next month, which I'll talk about at the end of the presentation. But thank you again for coming this evening, and would you give a warm welcome to Ted?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So you're going to have to bear with us. We had some technical difficulties. The main projector is not on, so we're using this older projector. And we originally put together a PowerPoint deck, but that won't work, so I'm actually running this off the internet, which is great because that's what we want you to do when you leave here is go home and pull up remarkable419.com, and you'll be able to go through this at your heart's content and kind of absorb all the information that we're going to share tonight. So quick background, I'm just a local history buff. I tell people I'm not an historian, I'm more of a storyteller. And I love to curate history, grab what's out there and pull it together and tell a story. And about 3 years ago, I was introduced to Matthew. He had just moved here from LA so that he could be closer, he and his wife, to their family. And his background was in interior photography and architectural photography. And John Eichost from Toledo.com introduced us and said, well, you got to meet Ted. He's into buildings and history. So we met, and it was like, you know, two lost brothers. We had lunch, and by the end of the lunch, we were planning a book. And the book is Remarkable 419. Originally, it was just Remarkable Spaces. And the idea behind it was we didn't want to just focus on downtown buildings, but just spaces, whether they're churches, barns, homes, commercial buildings, whatever it is, something that is remarkable from the look and feel of the architecture, but also the backstory. And that's what I'm into, is the backstory of history. So we got started, and in the last few months, we've been doing some interesting things. We just launched a series of walking tours of downtown Toledo. And you access these through an app on your phone called Voice Map. Download it for free on Android or Apple. I sound like I'm doing a commercial. And once you have it loaded, it goes up to the satellite and comes back and says, oh, you're in Toledo. Here are the different walking tours available, and there's driving tours as well. You may be familiar with the Unholy Toledo tour, which is the gangster tour I did for the Valentine Theatre and the Toledo History Museum a few years ago. That's what kind of got that started. So last month we launched 2 downtown walking tours that both last about an hour and take you through downtown and tell you the history of all the buildings. And the beauty of it is, because it's phone-based, it's GPS-based, and I know where you're at. So while you're standing there, I can say, turn to your left. That's the NASB building, and I tell you all about it. And I say, okay, now pivot to the right. This is the Nicholas building, and I can tell you all about that. And then I give you directions on where the next place to go. So as we were developing that, one of the things that kept coming back to us was, interesting to us when you look at the history and the architecture, was the mood of the city, the mood of the glass city when these buildings were built. And so as a child of the 60s and 70s, I thought about the mood ring. Remember? You guys all look like you're old enough to remember that. I have some kids at work, I told them about it today, and they looked at me like I had 2 heads. And I had to explain what the mood ring was. But it's hard to see back here behind me, but there's a hand over some postcards of buildings in Toledo, and that person has a mood ring on. And the mood ring would change colors based on temperature and other factors and supposedly tell you your mood. Well, we think buildings tell you the mood of the city when the buildings were built. And if it's not in the architecture, it's in the history of the building itself, and that's what we're going to do tonight. We're not aware of anybody else doing this. We built a timeline, and we're taking buildings that are still existing in Toledo, and we're going to talk about the mood of those buildings as they were built. And I'm going to have to be careful because I keep losing the sound here. So as I said, this is all online, so I'm going to have to kind of hover over this machine so I can click through everything. The first building we're going to start with is the Oliver House, 1859, probably one of the oldest buildings in downtown Toledo, and certainly the oldest building we're going to cover today. And you see at the bottom, we talk about the mood being hopeful at the bottom here. And it was hopeful because in 1859, Toledo was really just getting its start. And the Oliver House was in a very odd position. And a lot of people don't understand is that the Oliver House was built on the middle grounds because at that time, the middle grounds were the downtown of Toledo. There was no downtown that we know today. That was a swamp. That was called Mud Creek. And so they built a church, a train station, a smaller hotel, and then in 1859, they bring in really the father of the modern hotel, and they build the Oliver House. And the Oliver House was different than anything else that anyone had seen before in Toledo. Before this, hotels were mostly of the... Guys, what am I doing wrong on this mic? Good.
Testing.
I could do it without a mic. You're always in, Ted. All right, yeah. How's this? This better? We'll try this. So before the Oliver House, all the hotels in Toledo were what we call the country inn variety. You know what I'm talking about? They were mostly homes, and they had a couple of boarding house rooms, and you came down and you had dinner and breakfast with Mrs. Smith, who owned the building. There wasn't a modern hotel. So in 1859, now we have this modern hotel, 100 rooms, parlors, damask wall hangings, very sophisticated restaurants serving exotic food. It was totally different than anyone had seen in Toledo. So the mood was very hopeful. It was hopeful that Toledo was now on the map. We were going to be a major city and we're going to move forward together. So that's the first building, the Oliver House, 1859. The next building, you might not think of it this way. The mood here for St. Francis de Sales Chapel is euphoria. We're now in 1869, so we're talking post-Civil War. The war is over. The North has won. Toledo is just really beginning to feel its oats, and the major development of Toledo is going to happen in the next couple of decades. But in the meantime, Toledo is now transforming from an area where people are coming in mostly from upstate New York. We didn't have immigrants per se until about this time. Most of the people that came into Toledo came down the canal in New York, crossed Lake Erie, came up the river, got off at Swan Creek, most of whom were trying to get west, and a lot of whom said, you know what, this isn't bad, I'm going to stay here. By 1869, it's a different story. Now we have people actually immigrating from Europe, coming into the United States. They've heard about Toledo, and they cross the country, and they come here to live. And now we're building churches, and this goes back to this whole idea of Holy Toledo. There's a lot of different stories about how we got that name. I think my favorite is the one that Danny Thomas said, that Toledo was Holy Toledo because when in vaudeville days, Holy Week was the worst week of vaudeville. And he said, every week's Holy Week in Toledo. It's Holy Toledo, but we'll leave that alone. But it was Holy Toledo because it was so flat, and when you arrived here, you could see steeples. And there was all these different ethnic enclaves where people had built these churches and developed these neighborhoods. And this particular one was servicing an interesting mix, French, German, and Irish. And it was built what was considered to be on the outskirts of what was what would become downtown in what was still considered the Vistula district. So, and it was designed by a person who designed about 400 Catholic chapels or cathedrals or churches in the United States. He was known for a number of cathedrals that he built in New York City. This was actually the cathedral for Toledo when the diocese was formed in 1910, and it stayed the diocese cathedral until 1933, I think, when they opened Rosary Cathedral. One thing I always point out to people, and I always get this question, what happened to the steeple? There was never a steeple here. There was never a steeple on this building. But this was the original cathedral, and when it was built, I think the mood was one of euphoria. The war is over, North is won, people are starting to come into Toledo from different areas of the world, and Toledo is going to be this really, dynamic city, and there's all kinds of hope for what's going to happen in the future. We skip ahead now to 1893 and the Gardner Building. You guys familiar with this, on the corner of Madison and Superior? Interesting, the mood here is actually tension. 1893 had a major depression and economic panic, and nobody knew what was going to happen. This is when the United States was trying to figure out what it wanted to do with silver versus gold. There were all kinds of tariffs and other issues that were going on, and the economy was very unstable. But the Gardner family decided to build this wonderful building, and they did it using a very unique technology at that time. This is one of the first buildings constructed with cement, and so it was claimed to be fireproof. It was claimed to be very solid, and today it's still listed in the National Register of Historic Places, but it's also designated a civil engineering landmark because it was one of the first buildings built in this style. The person who actually designed it and built it was Charles Gardner of the Gardner family. He was a well-traveled guy, had been over to Europe, and he wanted this to look very much like the Strozzi Palace in Florence, Italy. So he copied a lot of the details and put it into the family's building. But the mood at that time was one of very tense nature, very tense because of just what's going on with the economy and what's going to happen with Toledo going forward. Now, this is the same year that Libby opens their pavilion at the World's Fair in Chicago, so we're not the Glass City yet. So there's still a lot of question about where is Toledo going. The other thing that's interesting, by 1893, people had figured out about 10 years earlier that they missed the boat in Toledo. Toledo thought they were going to be the grain capital of the world. And then things just flew right past them, and Chicago exploded. Everything west of Toledo exploded. And so it took some young guns to convince the old-timers that, hey, we missed that one. We need to think about industry. And so that's when they, in the 1880s, attracted Libby and others to come here and start thinking about Toledo other than a grain center, but actually an industrial center. And that starts to take off here about 1890s. The NASB, one of my favorites. This is 1895. It was built between 1891 and 1895, right during this depression. So that you can see they took their time. This was a building that became Toledo's first skyscraper. Still standing today on that Four Corners area. Certainly doesn't look like it did in the day it was built. You can see here that it was just an absolutely gorgeous building, and the mood here we described as reflective. Because they could have built anything here. They could have just gone to the old Chicago commercial style and said, let's just build a 7 or 8 story building and call it done. But they went beyond that, and they went back to this idea of our tie to Toledo, Spain, and they built this really beautiful Spanish style, a lot of really impressive material used to give it this look and feel, and particularly the top 4 stories where they built this ornate tower. And that tower was designed originally to emulate the Giralda Tower of Seville, Spain. Unfortunately, in the 1900s, the terracotta started to wear off. Wear off, is that? I don't know how it works, but terracotta started to give up, and it deteriorated, and it started falling. And so it became a safety hazard to walk near this building, so they took the whole tower down. And then worse yet, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they started slapping up all this asbestos paneling to cover up the beautiful terracotta work that now you can see today since it's all been peeled back. But again, this building, beautiful example of the mood of being reflective. Like I said before, they could have put any building up, but they didn't. They wanted to build a building that said something about Toledo and Toledo's nature and the Toledo story. The Valentine Theatre. We've labeled the mood here, if you were to look at your mood ring. And by the way, this doesn't always work, but either did the mood ring. So give me a break on that. But we said playful. Now, why would you think this was playful? One of the things I learned in the first book that I wrote called Forgotten Visitors, it was a compilation of about 25 people who visited Toledo over 200 years. And when I started getting into like Mark Twain, Sarah Bernhardt, and some of these people that came here in the 1860s to 1880s, there was no real big cultural venue for them to visit. We didn't have the Valentine. We didn't have Seagate Center or Glass City Center, places like that that they could perform at. Mark Twain came here in 1869. He actually did his lecture in White's Hall, which was located where 4 Seagate sits today, and that was the 3rd floor of a dry goods store. And that was it. That's what we had. So in the 1870s, the Wheeler family got together, raised the money, and they built the Wheeler Opera House. Unfortunately, it was absolutely gorgeous. If you get a chance, look it up sometime, Google it. There's drawings of what the building looked like. Fantastic. It burned to the ground in 1893. And so now the whole community is standing around going, what are we going to do next? There were several people with lots of money that could afford to do something, including the Reynolds family. But it was George Ketchum, Valentine Ketchum's son, who had just received $1 million from his dad's estate, who said, no, I'm going to build a theater. All the rest of the people in town at that time were going to raise money. George Ketchum just pulled the cash out and said, no, I'm going to build a building. And he didn't mess around. He brought in E.O. Fallis, who was at that time one of the top architects in the community. Fallis looked at what was going on in Chicago, and it's playful in the sense that, again, they could have built just a theater. They didn't. They built this massive facility with, very playful outside, but on the inside, very Victorian. And then they had this incredible cantilevered balcony. And it had only been done once before in Chicago, and they did it again here in Toledo. And that set the Valentine apart from anything else. Christmas Day when it opened, the story is that Fallis wasn't sure about the cantilever balcony, so he told his family to go upstairs and he was going to sit underneath it by himself, and if it came down, he'd go down with the ship. But the nature here and the mood, I think, is one more of about playfulness. Because again, we could have built just any theater, but we didn't, and they took the time to build something that was very playful, very unique. Lucas County Courthouse. So the name that comes up here is David L. Stein, who is considered really the master architect of Toledo. You go to the Old West End, many beautiful homes designed by David L. Stein. He actually presented a plan for Lucas County Courthouse. The original courthouse, believe it or not, was going to be built on the middle grounds. They actually dug the basement, and then they changed everything and decided to move the county seat to Maumee. They built a courthouse in Maumee where the library sits today. Then they switched it back to Toledo. They built kind of a Greek motif courthouse in the 1850s on the same lot that the courthouse sits today. And by the 1880s, they were like, it's time. We got to do something. That's too small. We need something much larger and much grander. He put together an outrageous plan. I mean, it had this huge tower, clock tower, and they kind of told him, go back to the books, man. That's just too ostentatious for us. That's not going to work. He ended up taking some of that design and used it for the development of the Wyoming State Capitol. And if you look at the Wyoming State Capitol, which just got a multi-million-dollar redo today, and compare it to what we have today, they're very similar in certain aspects. But they took that original design that was going to be used here, used a lot of it in Wyoming. He lived out there while it was being managed or built. He was project manager. He comes back in the 1890s, and now the county has the money, and they want to do something grand. They give him a budget. He sketches everything out, gets ready to start the process, and then they could tell him, oh, by the way, same budget, but we need you to do a county jail and a sheriff's residence. So when you look at the county courthouse today, the outside is incredible. The inside, not so much. And you can compare it to buildings like the Wyoming State Capitol, the interior of that building filled with all kinds of decadence. It's just gorgeous. Ours, there's some marble wainscoting and some other things, but it's really not that spectacular because he had to take this budget and spread it across these other buildings. But one thing he did do is he did a mosaic in the Adams Street entrance and put a frog in the center when you walk in. Unfortunately, that's all closed off right now because of security, but if you can get in the building, you can walk down there and you can still see it. It's beautiful. And that was a kind of a look back to the idea of Toledo being Frogtown. And that area where that courthouse was built, as I said earlier, was all marsh and part of Muddy Creek. And Stein, went kind of reflective and said, we can build a grand place, but we have to also give credit where it's due and what we did in this town and draining this and making this a place we could all live and feel proud of. So the mood here is proud. I don't know what color that was on a mood ring, but it's proud. So just hang with me on that one. Water Street Station. Now, Randy Ostra and I sat on the top of one Seagate 10 years ago. I'd given him a tour of Toledo from the top of one Seagate. And he took me overlooking the main steam plant at the time that we all called it. And he said, you see that building? I said, yeah. And he goes, I'm going to buy it and make it my headquarters, and I'm going to make you the historian. And I was over the moon. And I ended up doing a project. If you've ever been inside the renewed ProMedica headquarters, there's about a 350-foot long wall with the story of Toledo. And I did that with their design crew. And I was happy to be part of that process. But what was interesting was when they were putting it all together, they were trying to decide what they were going to call their new headquarters, and they put it out to the employees to vote on it. And it was like the steam plant, the brick building. I don't remember what the other choices were, but they didn't know that the original name was Water Street Station, so they didn't give them the choice. To me, Water Street Station, beautiful name for a building sitting right there on the water. And Water Street Station was actually one of several stations built by Toledo Traction to power the trolley cars that were taking blue-collar workers all over Toledo to these new industrial jobs. And so when it was built, it was one of the largest powerhouses in the Midwest. Unfortunately, it was too small from the day it opened, and they were constantly expanding it to keep up with the demand for electricity until right after World War I, when they built the Acme plant over on the east side. Then in 1929, they converted it to a steam plant. But the story there, I think, is interesting, particularly when Matthew talks a little bit about the idea of reuse. Here's a building that has just gone up and down in different arcs and how it's been used by the community. At one time, when it first opened, it was a technology marvel that we had electricity, we were powering these streetcars, and then technology changed, it becomes a steam plant, then it sits empty for 30 years, and now it's headquarters for a service organization that has its fingers in a lot of things around the community. So it's an interesting story in terms of the arc. But we would say that the mood when this opened was hopeful. Toledo was hopeful that they were going to be part of the next century and all this technology that was going to come with it and all the technology that electrical power was going to drive. The Ohio Building. Anybody not familiar with the Ohio Building on Madison? It's hard to tell all the buildings apart. But this is a building, I do a lot of downtown tours, and I stop people and I'll say, what do you know about this building? Some people will say, it used to be home for Toledo Edison. And it was before we built Edison Plaza. But the key to this building is the motif of the building is strictly Chicago commercial. But what's interesting is the romantic nature of it. This was designed at the time that Ohio was celebrating its 100th anniversary, its centennial. So what do? You build the Ohio Building. and you put a frieze on the outside of the building over the main entrance that tells the story of the pioneers who settled Ohio. And as I said, I give tours all the time, and I stop people, and then I point the frieze out, and they're like, I have never seen that before. No one's ever pointed it out. I had no idea it was there. So the next time you're down there, take a look. You got to look up. You got to look up. But the next time you're down there, take a look, and you'll see it. And it's just a magnificent exhibition of what the mood was at that time. The mood was one of pride and one of romance. It was the romance of the pioneers who settled the area, and they did it in this modern building. Pretty cool. Nicholas Building looks very similar to the Ohio Building. Why? Because they were built very close together, but they were also built based on that same commercial style that I talked about. Now, I mentioned the panic in 1893. I think I kind of skimmed over. There were several buildings that production just stopped because they didn't know what was going to happen with the economy. And they started some of the buildings downtown and just waited to see what was going to happen. The Nicholas Building comes 10 years after the Spitzer family built the Spitzer Building. And now they had suffered through the 1893 panic. Spitzer Building sat for 2 years with 4 floors built before they went back in and finished it in 1895. Then they waited another few years and put a 10-story addition, all waiting on the economy to catch up. And now by this time, 1906, Toledo is off. I mean, it is off to the races. Now you've got Libby producing all this glass. The automobile industry is now just getting its start. Toledo is really taking off. And one of the issues was, where are we going to find enough space, office space downtown? So they built this pretty quickly. So I would say the mood was restless. They were pretty restless in terms of how they were going to manage all the things that are going on that are happening in 1906. Toledo Museum of Art, 1912. I mean, what can you say? Clearly, it's a reflective mood. They could have built any number of different designs, but they went back and looked at the idea of, and this was designed, by the way, by Edward Green and Harry Wachter. They had articulated by the front of the building, white marble articulated by a row of 16 columns, copper roof, and then a frieze of acanthus leaves over the entranceway. This is an architecturally significant building in Toledo, not just because Toledo Museum of Art is such an important art center in terms of world art, but also because of how it was developed. I love how people always say Edward Drummond Libby, and they clench their teeth like they're going to say Thurston Howell III. But he could have written a check and just paid the building off. But he didn't. He engaged the community, and he got kids collecting pennies. He got everyone in the community to participate, and he said, I'm going to pay for half, and you have to pay for half. In the end, he paid for 99% of the building, but he engaged the community, and it was their museum, and that was very unique at that time. So I would say, again, reflective in that they looked back in terms of the architecture, and so the mood itself, I think, was one of looking forward, but at the same time also looking back in the past. Second National Bank, we know this today as the Riverview Apartments. Interesting building. We talk about the NASB being the first skyscraper in Toledo. This is really the first serious skyscraper building. 21 stories, it towers above everything else in the city when it's built. It's close to the river's edge. And it was built by Second National Bank, who had roots going back to the 1860s. And the mood here, I think, is pretty easy to say, serious. The bank was very serious about establishing Toledo as a banking center that can compete with Cincinnati, Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland. And how do you do that? You build a 21-story skyscraper that people can see from miles as they approach Toledo, and people know that's Second National Bank. This also launched an ego war that we talk about in Toledo architecture, in which all the other bankers after this building was built had to top it somehow, or at least try. So how do you compete with this beautiful 21-story building? Do you build one taller, or do you just build one that looks completely different, that stands on its own? And that's what most of them did, and that's what you see along Madison. is the results of this ego war. And one example would be the Northern Trust building, built in 1916. Here again, do you build a skyscraper, or do you build something that's really going to grab people's attention, and one that's going to really take advantage of this metaphor of neoclassical revival? You look at this building, you say, I'd put my money in there. Looks pretty safe to me, looks pretty strong, looks pretty classical. And that's what they were trying to do in using that metaphor. Tall skyscraper, or something that looks like something right out of a Greek neighborhood. LaSalle and Cook. LaSalle was founded in 1865 as one of Toledo's oldest dry goods stores. When they decided to build a downtown establishment, they did not mess around. They went to New York City and they hired the top architects who had built all the major big department stores in New York, and they built something very similar in downtown Toledo. It's hard to tell now because we can't get inside this building. Now it's mostly apartments, but it's amazing to me that the 9 main floors are each nearly the size of a football field. It's massive. And it really is set apart from everyone else. Paper mache floors. We'll talk about that. You'll have to explain that. But I think the mood here was one of festive. They weren't just going to build a department store. They were going to build a massive department store on the same scale as New York or Chicago and celebrate Toledo with the oldest dry goods store in Toledo. Civic Mall, not really a building, but a remarkable space. Plans for this actually started around 1900, and this was during an era where they were talking about a movement called the City Beautiful movement. By 1900, people were starting to realize all the bad things that came with a major urban center. It's one thing to have a nice city with beautiful skyscrapers, but what comes with that are crime, overpopulation, people who are unable to take care of themselves. All of that comes with that, and they were starting to realize, how do you deal with that? And one of the movements was the City Beautiful movement. And they said, well, look, if the city's beautiful, people are more pleasant and they'll treat each other better. And it'll be easier for people to get along when you're actually spending the time to make the city look better. And so around 1900, they started thinking about the City Beautiful movement, and they had started to target the area behind the courthouse. But it wasn't until 25, I think, that the city actually purchased that quadrangle between Jackson, Erie, Orange, and Spielbush. And then it was 1926 when they put the first structure in. Many different architects tried to get their fingers on this. It was actually E.O. Fallis who had most to do with the design of what we know today as the Civic Mall. So we would say the mood here, again, rather reflective, because they didn't look at anything modern. They went back and reflected on how public spaces have been used over the centuries, and they incorporated that into the design of the Civic Center. The Toledo Blade, 1927. This is a unique one. We said that the mood for this one is both reflective and festive. And it's festive in the standpoint that you look at that building and it has so much going on, but it also reflects back on Toledo, Spain, which is what they wanted to do. The Blade, being the oldest business in Toledo, started in 1835. When they were going to build this headquarters, they wanted to do something very unique, but they also wanted to do something that reflected back to Toledo, Spain, because that's where the name The Blade comes from. They used actually the first paper that was published in 1835. They said that I love this quote, December 19th, 1835, the Blade's first edition comes out. This is during the Toledo War, Michigan Territory against Ohio, trying to figure out what's going to happen. They published this paper and they said, quote, this, and they called it an affirmation. They said, we should prefer to keep our blade always in its scabbard and hope not to be compelled to use it often in the offensive. We hope it will always leap from its scabbard whenever the rights of individuals or of the community shall be infringed. And that's where the blade names comes from. And again, reflective back to this idea of Seville, Spain, where they made these famous blades. What's interesting about this building, when it opened in 1927, they wanted to also demonstrate technology and how the blade was a technology powerhouse. So Calvin Coolidge actually flipped a switch in Washington, D.C. that started the presses in Toledo, Ohio. Cool story. Lamson department store. So how do you top what happens with the previous story we talked about with LaSalle and Cook, or what we often refer to as Macy's? The Lamson brothers had a pretty tough, task. They want to build a downtown store. And what's interesting here is you got to be thinking about the era. No one is thinking about suburban flight. No one is thinking that everyone's going to scatter to the suburbs. Downtown is where all the shopping is going to happen. So you're going to build a massive shopping center where people can walk in and feel like $1 million as they stroll through your store and look at your goods. And Lamson's, they decided to go with this Florentine palace look. It was all carved stone. And what's interesting is they also put the emblems of various artists and craftsman guilds into the design, and those were actually from the Italy's Renaissance art groups, and they emblazoned those on the side of the building. So we say that this is sentimental, but it's also whimsical. If you really take your time and walk around the building and look at how they embedded these designs into the building, somebody was having fun when they decided this was, an interesting way to step this building up versus the competition. Last building I'm going to talk about, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew, is the safety building. A couple years ago, I did a tour of the safety building for Toledo History Museum. We promoted the heck out of it, and we had like 10 people show up. I was really surprised. I thought more people would want to see the inside of the place. It's actually pretty interesting. But the mood here is tense. And why would this be a tension-building mood for the city of Toledo? There's a couple things going on here. First of all, you got to understand that the time this was built, most of the city workers and the city hall were in the Valentine Building. And so there was all kinds of questions about what they're going to do to build something to get them out of that building. But worse is the city jail was on Superior Street, and it was an absolute dump. And as early as 1900, people were writing about how embarrassing the city jail was. Someone once wrote, it'd be better off pillaring people outside than forcing them to sit in a cell inside this dilapidated building. The police chief was bitten by a bull snake while he was sitting at his desk inside this building. There were rats running through it. It was awful. So they finally gathered the money and the design, and they built the safety building. There was a lot of controversy because it was a public space, not a commercial. How much were they spending? Where were they going to put it? And then to top it off, it was originally built as not really city hall, but more for police and fire. And there was, I think, a traffic court that was going to be in there. But the city employees and the politicians, as it got closer to finish, said, we're out of here. We're moving out of the Valentine. We're taking the place over. They moved in and immediately opened, and it was already overcrowded. So tension was a big part of the mood when the safety building was built. All right, I'm going to turn things over to Matthew now. He's going to take you through the Depression and up to modern day.
Thank you, Ted. Nice to see everybody. Thanks for coming. So here we are with the Ohio Savings and Trust, which was built in 1930. The building was occupied by the company for less than a year before closing due to the bank crash and resulting Great Depression. It is designed in the Art Deco style and features several gargoyles and figures of Mercury and Progress over the main entrance. Though it opened right before the Great Depression, it was designed during the Roaring '20s, which you can clearly see, and the prosperity of that time is shown throughout. This building reflects the mood of enormous prosperity in its design and such a great height. 1931 gives us University Hall at the University of Toledo, and it was a shot in the arm for a struggling city. We had large bank runs, and unemployment was extreme compared to the rest of Ohio. This hall took 900 workers to complete in just under a year of time. Along with the peristyle at the Museum of Art, we are seeing labor employment carrying a lot of families through a large part of the Great Depression, which lasted 10 years. It's like 20% of that time. These two buildings offered hope to Toledoans and created a mood of great relief. In 1939, Toledo gets the Bell Building and the main library. Two great examples of Art Deco design. In its heyday, Art Deco represented luxury and glamour and leaned into technological progress. We were nearing the end of the Depression, and Toledo was getting back to work. People had an idea that a big war was coming, and we had the spaces to crank up all the production for it. The Bell Building represents hope that we were pulling out of the Depression and bringing our city back to life. Smith's Cafeteria was open on the ground floor. We saw people were getting back downtown to work, and it was the first building to have air conditioning. Yeah. The main library was a beautiful space for the community to gather and featured local innovations like the mural set in vitrolite glass that was created by local glassmaker Libby Owens Ford. Two very solid structures that gave people a sense of hope. And if you guys have not seen the murals in the library, definitely go down and check it out in the main entry, and I believe it's the third floor in the children's library. With the return of this prosperity, we have new interests in designing downtown, which gains national attention with Toledo Tomorrow. The exuberance of this time is palpable in the special edition of the Toledo Blade with the headline reading, "Eyes of the Nation on Toledo Tomorrow." The war was ending, we were victorious, and now it was time to redesign our city. Toledo Tomorrow was a scale model of the city that integrated the expressway system for easy flow traffic, a central passenger depot for air, rail, and bus. The rail lines that were choking the city were to be realigned, and heavy industry was moved away from the river. With this prosperity, we had major growth in retail, and everybody had a car. Toledo was adjusting to people being more mobile in the downtown area, and the layout had to be changed to accommodate this. The mood in 1945 was surely ecstatic. There was a fair amount of criticism regarding the ideas of Toledo Tomorrow, but no one doubted the excitement in the plan. In 1950, Toledo sees the opening of Central Union Terminal. At a cost of $5 million, this is considered to be one of the last great New York Central Railroad stations. This project included 8 other buildings, and it also moved a coal loading facility out of East Toledo, giving it more of a neighborhood opportunity. Art Deco at this point was winding down, but it was a fantastic design style to help show off Toledo glass. This was a transportation palace that presented the city to the world, and Toledo's mood was very progressive at the time. What's that? Different story, right? This being the glass city, it's time to talk about the headquarters of Libby Owens Ford. It had been 32 years since Toledo had seen a modern skyscraper, and this building seemed to have come from the future. Toledo is home to several Fortune 500 companies, and this building is a bold display of economic progress as well as industrial engineering. To this point, we had not seen buildings seemingly made entirely of glass. Built in the new international style, the LOF building had an open plaza that served as a social gathering place. The ground floor walls are 20 feet high, made entirely of glass, and this opened the building to the public. This design continued on every floor, making it more of an open office and flooding the spaces with natural light. Even the plaza was heated in order to melt the snow away in the winter, making it hospitable to anybody passing by. This building represented so much of what Toledo had worked to build that the construction process turned into a spectacle. So much so that they installed a closed-circuit TV camera on the upper girders so spectators on the ground level could watch a giant crane move steel beams into place on the tallest floor. Everybody was excited. You can imagine how risky the design of the LOF tower seemed at the time. We were moving away from materials like stone and brick to a sleeker, repetitive design. The LOF building looked like nothing we had seen. It was so unique that it started an ego war among the local glass companies. This was a time of peak business in Toledo, and the top businesses wanted to show off their success to the world. Both the LOF building and the fiberglass tower were designed by nationally renowned architects who were working on world-famous buildings in Chicago and New York City. Owens Corning Fiberglass Company was growing steadily, and their design of the fiberglass tower took everybody to new heights downtown at 29 floors. The tower uses all the hallmarks of international design. You have the plaza, the columnless open floor plan, the glass curtain wall, and the best views that anybody had ever seen. The mood here was pure competition. Continuing in the international style of skyscrapers, we have One Seagate come to town in 1982. This building is a large part of the Seagate plan, and it tops out at 32 stories, the tallest still in downtown Toledo. Constructed as the headquarters of Owens, Illinois, this building represents the further growth of the glass industry, the budding growth of the financial services industry, and the renewal of downtown. We are nearly 40 years past Toledo tomorrow, and the Seagate plan had its eyes set on cleaning up the riverfront, which gives us all a mood of feeling rejuvenated. The next year, 1983, brings one government center. This building helped to consolidate the government agencies that had spread around downtown. It also is furthering the central planning and redesign initiatives of the Seagate plan. It's designed by Minoru Yamasaki, who's the architect of the First World Trade Center, and it has a nearly identical twin in downtown Minneapolis. This shows that Toledo is part of the larger cities of the country coming off years of great expanding growth and prosperity. The consolidation of these county and city employees left one building at risk of being torn down, the Valentine. Thankfully, the city of Toledo announced demolition plans for the theater, but thankfully, the community embraced the idea of rehab and reuse, setting us on a very prosperous mood. In 1987, Toledo gets a convention center, now known as the Glass City Center. This convention center pulls people down Summit Street and is a part of the Seagate plan to boost commercial space and tourism. Designed by SSOE, which is a local company with a global reach, we now have a place to show our products to the country, and a hotel is attached. This brings in a calendar of tourism, inviting everybody to see how the downtown area has been modernized and the neighborhood starts to change into an entertainment district for all of these visitors. We build great things here, and we are proud to show them off. So it's a very prideful mood. In the mid-90s, Toledo was lost. It had been a while since we'd seen any development of the Seagate plan come to fruition, and Toledo Trust had closed its doors after 122 years in business. On top of this bleak outlook, Owens Corning had outgrown the fiberglass tower and was threatening to leave Toledo altogether. Luckily, a deal was struck for them to take the middle grounds, a key part of the downtown area that was in need of a lot of renovation. Designed by world-renowned architects Pelly Clark Pelly, this building, the new Owens Corning headquarters, was a breath of fresh air that brought a great feeling of relief to the city of Toledo. Not only does the city get to maintain a Fortune 500 company, it gains a partner in continuing the cleanup of the riverfront and continuing with our construction engineering prowess and changing office environments. The Owens Corning headquarters was sustainably designed and has been nationally recognized. Not only did it help clean up our past, it shows respect to our river as it is designed to look like a lake freighter sailing on the Maumee. Keeping a great company like Owens Corning and seeing the area become a beautiful part of downtown gives us a very thankful mood. That brings us to today and the future. Right now in Toledo, we are seeing a great deal of adaptive reuse projects. Gateway at Vistula, I don't know if anybody's been down there to see it, but it's been widely reported on, is a perfect example of this. Westminster Church here is an anchor for the project, and most people are familiar with it as a place they played basketball in their youth, right? The space is now, so this church is the anchor of the whole project, which will be an office space as well as restaurants and storefronts, local stores, and it will bring the community together. You have new residential spaces along Summit Street with the Wonder Bread Factory, new bars, restaurants that are all going to support the neighborhood. Along Collingwood Boulevard, we're seeing religious institutions begin to adapt to the changing nature of worship. Collingwood Presbyterian has embarked on a study to transform itself into a community center. We are retrofitting existing buildings with new technologies and breathing life into our past right now. Ted and I have followed a couple of these projects over the years, and we've seen the work and consideration that has gone into them, as well as the hurdles that have been cleared to get things complete. We are living in a very chaotic time, but the mood of Toledo is incredibly determined. Thank you very much.
You want to know what happened to it? No idea. Just like the model itself. It's just two things in the Toledo history that have just disappeared, sadly. Yeah. Yeah. No one knows. I mean, but some people think it's still locked up in a warehouse somewhere. I hope it is, and I hope someone finds it. Yeah, it was in the little theater. Yeah, but it was actually ordered up and paid for by the Paul Block, and Bel Geddes was brought in to do it, who was world renowned in terms of his vision for the future. Many other items that came out of, yes, exactly, and also disappeared and have shown up on auction sites over the years. Yep, sadly. Yeah, there's a great article if you ever want to know what happened to a lot of that stuff, and I think it was 2002. Tyree Lane wrote it for The Blade, and you can just Google it. I think it's called Toledo Memories Gone, and it tells the whole story of how a lot of that stuff just disappeared over time, sadly. Other questions? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah. A book on the residential homes in the Toledo area. Ted Ligabell did one a few years back, Lights Along the River, I think. It's a book Matthew and I both have studied. One of the things that's going to come out of this project is our own coffee table book, Remarkable 419. And we've spent a lot of times in many of these homes, and we definitely are going to try to, kind of cover the area in terms of the variety, and then also just in our mind, there's some homes that you might drive by and not feel would make a list, but they are truly remarkable when you figure out the backstory and then how they were built and why they were built. And so those would be included in the book as well. Mm-hmm. French Provincial and Westmoreland. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah, exactly. Bill, his books are ones that I've depended on for years. What we did today was try to cover buildings that are standing today, and Speck's book go really into detail of all the, sadly, buildings that have been demolished over time. And I'll tell you, one of the saddest things that happened in Toledo came out of the post-war boom. If you see pictures of downtown Toledo in 1946, 47, 48, there are cars everywhere. There's no place to park them. Streets are piled up with cars. Traffic was a huge issue. And the city of Toledo passed an ordinance that said if you had so much retail space, you had to have so much parking space. So they just started tearing buildings down for surface parking lots. And that's how we ended up with downtown the way it is today. It was actually caused by an ordinance that the city put in place. And it's very, very sad when you think about the buildings we lost. But William Speck's books go into detail. He's did a fantastic job of researching each building, and then he has photographs of all the buildings as well, many of which, you just never know. When you see these pictures and you think that sat right there at that corner, and today it's a surface parking lot. Other questions? Okay, I'm going to let Robin talk about the next speaker. Thank you, everybody.
I think, Ted and Matthew, the mood of the audience tonight is one of gratitude that you are keeping these stories alive and you're sharing them with the community, especially the younger generation, because they have no idea the backstories of these buildings. So thank you very much. Our next lecture is going to be held November 10th at Woodward High School. I promise you it's easier to find the auditorium there. Okay, we learn. Lou Hebert will be presenting his book Day by Day in Toledo. If you know Lou, he's a great storyteller, and he literally sat at the main library for hours on end, read old newspapers, and came up with some really interesting and fascinating stories throughout the history of Toledo. So you will enjoy that. And then in January, we're back at Scott High School. Joe Boggs is going to be doing a lecture on Prohibition. If you are into local history, this Saturday at Forest Cemetery, we're having a major event. The dedication for the new marker for Olive Colton, who was a major Toledo suffragist, will be dedicated. In fact, the president of the National League of Women Voters is flying in for the event, and there is a tour of all the well-known Toledo suffragists right after the dedication of the marker. So that's this Saturday, 10:30 at Forest Cemetery. So thank you again so much for coming tonight. Please stick around if you have any questions. Enjoy your evening.